After 1.5 years of eagerly waiting since the launch of Security Breach, especially considering the immense backlash caused by it, which has left a void in many of the fans who began to doubt Steel Wool. A lot has been riding on this new entry to the franchise, the Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach Ruin DLC, which released on the 25th of July 2023. I myself have played it on stream, so if you want to check out the VODs, feel free to do so after this video. But today I aim to answer the question, is it any good? Upon the launch of Security Breach on December 16th of 2021, it was quite apparent just how much of a disastrous launch it ended up being. And while two major patches were released in 2022, the damage had already been done. So, it was announced in that same year that in 2023, we would be getting a free DLC for the game that would add back a lot of the scrapped content from the original game that was cut out due to either time constraints or budget constraints, either or both of which could be true. 2022 was also the year we got a new book series named Tales from the Pizzaplex, which was a hot topic of discussion from its inception till now, with the main debate being about its canonicity to the game's timeline. And it seems Ruin may have just given us an answer to that, or at least a better hint towards the answer of that debate. Now, before we jump into the actual game, let me just provide my 2 cents on the books. And if you're not watching this as a premiere, but as a video, and would like to skip this, simply move on to the next chapter of the video. With that said, I'll try to keep this fairly short, but I think the stories are decent, and the concept of the books being a parallel to the games works because it doesn't necessarily mean that they are a must-have thing. But now, it seems that these stories are canon, which means you'll have to read through them even if you don't enjoy them. And that's kind of where I lost interest with the books. Don't get me wrong, I don't think the books themselves are bad, but it's just that, for me at least, they feel like a chore to keep up with, rather than something I actually want to do with my own time. So, with all that said, let's dive in to Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach Ruin. After the fall of Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex, a young girl named Cassie enters the Pizzaplex in search of her friend Gregory. Apparently, Gregory was stuck under the Pizzaplex and called her friend for help. The game opens with her at the lobby entrance of the Pizzaplex. Right as the game begins, the shift in tone is immediately made clear to the player. The once colorful, vibrant, and charming Pizzaplex that us players explored is no longer a thing, instead being replaced by a mall in ruin. Walls with graffiti on them, broken statues, and in general, just a dirtier environment. In Ruin, the colorful environments have been dulled out for a more horror-centric approach. It is also important to note that a lot of areas that were previously available to explore, such as Rockstar Row, the Atrium, etc., are blocked off, as this expansion of the base game takes a far more linear approach to itself, which I think is better for a small studio like Steel Wool, since they can actually manage to make it and release it without it being game-breakingly glitchy within a reasonable amount of time. If you remember the Shattered Chica section from Security Breach, then you must also remember that it was quite dirty below the Pizzaplex, with tons of trash everywhere. Well, now that has basically extended to the rest of the Pizzaplex, rather than just being in the underground tunnels. By the first 10 to 15 minutes of the game, you'll know the stark contrast of the tones between the base game and the DLC. You'll notice familiar locations, but with vastly different lighting and audio. However, we will go more into that in a later section. However, dark and dreadful isn't the only thing about this DLC, as we are introduced to the Vanny Mask, or its full name, the Virtual Augmented Neural Network Integration Unit. Now, what's so interesting about this mask is, well, once you put it on, you'll be in an augmented reality simulation which will allow you to not only see through objects in the physical world, but even pass through them. This makes the game a lot more interesting, as oftentimes you'll see things in rooms or pathways that you couldn't in the physical world. The world, upon putting on the mask, looks more purple and reddish. I think it was quite an interesting addition to the series that still has more potential to be further explored in future entries. This time around, all the stab bots have been removed, which I'm sure is universally appreciated by everyone. Unlike the base game, the animatronics don't immediately kill you when spotted, except for maybe Monty. Chica, Monty and Roxy are in even worse shape compared to their shattered counterparts from Security Breach. Chica has molding all over her, likely due to her consuming more and more trash over the span of the Pizzaplex's collapse. She isn't extremely hostile towards the player, but there are a few sections where you'll have to get past her by using audio lures via the cameras. Interestingly enough, there is a minigame in the Ruin DLC themed around Chica, which, upon beating, actually allows you to reinstall a voice box into her. So far, we're not sure if it leads into any changes for the game's story, but it is certainly noteworthy. Monty is basically an endoskeleton crawling around the Pizzaplex at this point. All he has remaining from his initial design is a strand of red hair above his head. Otherwise, he's now going around full Terminator style. We actually encounter him quite early into the game, just like Chica. Out of the three, he seems to be the most hostile, as he usually does go after Cassie, and he ultimately gets electrified to death pretty much. Also, it should be noted that he acts a lot more like an actual gator in Ruin. There is one section where you have to go from one place to another by jumping on top of floating boxes and materials on water, and in this section, Monty swims in the water. So if you're in there for too long, game over. Just like how gators wait till you fall into the water to strike, it's the same for Monty. So I think that was a nice addition. The game also gives us a bit of backstory for Monty, like how he started out as a performer for his own attraction and went on to become one of the main 4 animatronics of the Pizzaplex. Roxy, on the other hand, is quickly becoming everyone's favorite animatronic after Ruin, and rightly so. She's quite different from how she was in the base game. When we first encounter her, it seems she's still searching for Gregory, because he had taken away her eyes. In this game, however, she isn't really hostile towards Cassie. We learned quite early into the game that Roxy was Cassie's favorite, and later on, we also learned that they had actually met before, as Roxy recognized her voice and even remembered her birthday. Some people speculated that she would be a kind of guardian character for Cassie, just like Freddy was with Gregory. And while it's not exactly that, with her still having to roam across the Pizzaplex by herself, Roxy ends up helping her at the very end. There is also quite an emotional scene where she has to deactivate Roxy to go below the raceway and save Gregory. Overall, I would have liked a bit more development between the two, but still, it was a nice addition to the game. We aren't entirely sure if she survives the final boss fight. However, after one of the ending cutscenes, we hear her calling out to Cassie, meaning she likely survived. Now, those were the main 3 animatronics that hunted Gregory in Security Breach. But we also have some other characters, such as Freddy, Helpy, Eclipse, etc. Freddy doesn't actually have much of a role in Ruin. He only appears in one section. However, it might not actually be the Freddy that accompanies Gregory in Security Breach, as this one has prototype written on its foot, while the one in the base game didn't. It's also interesting to note that if you bring Freddy to the Endo section of the base game, he starts having an existential crisis about how he may not be the first or only Glamrock Freddy, which may explain why this one in Ruin is so hostile towards Cassie. There are counter arguments as well, like how it's missing its head just like in the Prince's Quest ending, and how its body is lying in Phasoblast, just like in that ending. So maybe the prototype writing was covered up by paint earlier but came off as time went by. Both explanations work, but until we have access to further material, we're not entirely sure. As for his role in Ruin, it activates all of a sudden in Phasoblast and starts chasing Cassie. Its design kinda resembles Nightmare Fredbear, in the aspect that it has sharp looking stomach mouth, which it even uses in the jump scare animation. I think he could have had a bigger role in Ruin, but for the part that he is present in, it works. The daycare attendant, just like in Security Breach, has only one section, and similarly, it's in the daycare itself. However, this time it works differently. I think I should mention that before the launch of Ruin, the director, Ray McCaffrey, said that Ruin ditches the stealth aspect from the original game for a more patient-based gameplay. However, we will dive further into that in a later section. But with that context, in the daycare section this time, you'll have to unlock pathways by putting on the Vanny mask and finding out anomalies via the cameras. However, you'll have to take out the mask fairly quickly, as otherwise a certain entity that I will mention right after this will hunt you. This is where the patient aspect comes in, since you'll have to wait a couple of seconds after taking the mask off to progress to the next area within the play structures. In Ruin, it seems that there's an internal battle going on between Sun and Moon for control of the body, which is why Sun requests Cassie to reboot Moon after turning on the generators. If done successfully, after the reboot, they become one personality, named Eclipse. Eclipse seems like a mix of Sun and Moon, where Sun was a bit crazy and joyful, Moon would take responsibility for putting the kids to sleep on time. So, it makes sense why Eclipse seems like a joyful character, who also makes sure that the kids are safe. I can honestly see why some people would be inclined to say that Eclipse was their favorite. I want to mention a bit more about the Vanny mask, as it introduces two characters, one being an assistant named Helpy, and the other being the Mix's security entity. The Mix's security entity is a black rabbit with white stripes on his body. It's a glitching entity that only appears in the AR world. It was likely designed by Gregory and Vanessa, or Cassie's father, to keep the mimic locked away. It travels by teleporting closer and closer to the player. When Cassie puts the mask on, this entity is able to detect her location. It spawns if she uses the AR mode for too long, and it sends out a signal to nearby hostile animatronics to kill you after. While the animatronics themselves cannot see you in AR mode, with the help of the entity's signal, they will be able to track you down. The character is what brings the patience aspect of the game, as oftentimes you'll have to wait for a couple seconds after putting the mask off to use it again. This entity also activates AR inhibitors across various locations to stop us from accessing the Vanny network, and at times even locks us in or out of the network until we complete a certain task. Helpy, meanwhile, is mainly an expository character that tells us what to do and where to go to do what we have to do. Helpy also, with the help of Gregory, or a certain other character more accurately, shuts off the Mix's security system for a bit via a signal chain. At the end of the game, when we finally disable security protocols and reach Gregory, we find out that it was never the real Gregory. Rather, it was an animatronic named the Mimic. This character was initially introduced in the books, which led to a lot of debates about its canonicity to the games. However, with the release of Ruin, we know that the Mimic is 100% canon to the game's timeline. As for its involvement in Ruin, it tries to convince Cassie that it is Gregory, before approaching to kill her, which gets thwarted by Roxy. After this, Cassie is chased by the Mimic under the Pizzaplex. This chase leads to 3 different endings. However, we will talk about that in a later section. With that said, some people are ecstatic that the Mimic is now canon, while others think that it is a bit of a cheap reveal. In my opinion, the Mimic is a great addition to the game's timeline, since people are tired of Afton coming back again and again. However, the issue is that it would mean that the Tale stories might be canon, which, for your average player, would simply be too much to catch up on. Which is why people in the community, myself included to an extent, are frustrated by the ambiguity of the canonicity. It is also interesting to note that there is an alternate scenario where it's the same chase scene, but the Mimic wears a costume this time, which is what it often did in the Tales books as well. This game also has a returning character from the older games, that is, Candy Cadet, first introduced in Five Nights at Freddy's 6. He appears shortly before the final chase and tells us a story about how a child's mother had locked a monster in the basement. She would sing a lullaby, which the monster learned to mimic, which it then used to get the child to let it escape. We'll dive into the story elements in a later section, of course. This game also shows us where the Glamrock Bonnie animatronic was at the whole time. We see it in an absolutely dismantled state, quite similar to the appearance of the shattered animatronics from the base game. We're also given more hints that Freddy and Bonnie were quite close, which explains Freddy's sadness about him when talking to Gregory about it. And finally, we're also reintroduced to the mini music men in this game. We see them residing within Bonnie Bowl, and oh my, are there a lot of them, which would explain why we encountered one in whichever vent we went to in the base. The soundtrack for this expansion is again, just like the atmosphere, a stark contrast from the base Security Breach. Sure, even the base game had some tracks with spooky noises and tension, but most of its tracks were full of charming and techno sounds that would want to make you go to the Pizzaplex in real life. However, in Ruin, besides the minigames, that is gone, with a constant haunting ambience following you wherever you go. Thanks to the ambient noises, a feeling of dread looms above you everywhere you go. As for the voice actors, Kellen and Marta do quite well as a daycare attendant and Roxanne respectively. Gregory too was a little better executed here compared to the base game, as he sounds a tad bit older, while in the base game, the voice felt as if it didn't fit a character like him at times. Andy, Cameron and Heather didn't have much of a prominent role this time around, but I think they did decently enough with what they were given. Cassie's voice actor, Astrid Wong Sirvi, actually does quite a good job overall. I think her lines and line delivery fit the character better than Gregory's did to his. Overall, Ruin handles audio design quite decently, especially for a horror game. Now, this is where the game falters quite a bit. It primarily consists of you, the player, having to charge up conduits to open up doors, walk, deactivate security nodes by putting on the mask, which allows you to progress, then walk. And this cycle keeps going on for pretty much right after the intro to the end of the game. I wouldn't blame you if you thought that this game was a visual novel, which kinda ironically makes it a bit similar to Sister Location. But more on that later. The stealth aspect of Security Breach has been completely removed, as stated earlier. The problem is, it's not really very captivating, for me at least. Oftentimes, when I found time to play this game, I just didn't feel like it, and would put it off to another time later on. And I think the gameplay itself is at fault for this. Yes, I know FNaF as a franchise started off with repetitive gameplay. However, the difference is, back in the Scott era of games, and even Help Wanted, the difficulty got harder and harder as you kept progressing, which led to you dying several times and thinking of newer strategies or ways to deal with a certain threat. Even Security Breach, for the absolute mess that it is, has some of these elements, and that game had many different aspects and different things for you to do. Like say, you could shoot some robots at Phaser Blast, or you could go to Gator Golf and play golf, etc. While here, the game is far more linear, which isn't inherently a bad thing of course, but if the gameplay isn't engaging enough to hook the player, then it quickly gets boring no matter how many cheap jump scares you put in every location. The difficulty never really increases by much, so eventually the experience just gets draining. The whole node deactivation shtick gets boring after a while, and honestly feels like a chore, just to walk to the next area to see the next set piece or environment. And speaking of cheap jump scares, Steel Wool, you have to understand the difference between a good cheap jump scare and one that doesn't really have any effect on the player. See, at the beginning of the game, the jump scares work pretty well in establishing the fact that this is far different from the base game. In my opinion, they kinda overdo it at the beginning, but even if we don't take that into account, after the intro, why is the game still putting out cheap jump scare after jump scare? Once you do it enough times, it simply doesn't work as intended. And I would like to mention something said by YouTuber PewDiePie back during the days of FNAF 4. If you know what to expect 4 times, then it's kinda like over. While this statement doesn't exactly apply to Ruin, I think it emphasizes the issue of forcing jump scares onto the player over and over again. Eventually, it simply loses its impact. As for the jump scares that still happen when the player fails to complete a certain task, these have some problems as well. While the jump scares from the base game were certainly not the best, I think that they're still better than these newer ones. In these ones, we can see that Cassie fights back for a brief second, but after that she eventually ends up getting killed. My problem is, these jump scares don't feel as if you're about to jump, from how scary the game wants them to be. The first time you see it, it's cool I suppose, but after the second or third time, they'll get extremely frustrating in my opinion, as not only did you fail to complete the task, you'll now have to wait for a few seconds for the jump scare animation to finish, which I think takes away from the horror and FNaF feel this game was going for. If I'm going to be honest, in this aspect, it's quite similar to Sister Location, but slightly inverted on its head, where in Sister Location, each new night would introduce a new type of gameplay, which led to none of them having any built-up difficulty. Here in Ruin, the whole walk, conduit, walk, node, walk cycle happens so many times that it just isn't interesting as when you initially started the game. With that said though, I think the whole Mexus entity aspect in AR mode was an okay addition. Sure, some find it to be quite annoying, and while I wouldn't entirely disagree, I think Steelwool was trying to make using the mask more tenseful, as if you kept it on, eventually you'd be hunted and killed. It wasn't executed as well as I and maybe even Steelwool themselves would like it to be, but I think they could expand on the concept to eventually get a better outcome from it. And while this game mostly removes aspects such as stealth and chases from the base game, the sections that do have chase sequences I think were done pretty well, such as the Headless Freddy chase and the final Mimic chase. I just wish that there was more of this in Ruin. Overall, I would say that this is the weakest part of the Ruin DLC, the player experience, which is primarily the gameplay. It focuses on the story for the detriment of the gameplay. Now, if you're a FNaF fanatic like say Doko, ID's Fantasy, MatPat and more, you'll be quite satisfied with the game. However, for anyone who just wants to play the game and doesn't care about the lore due to just how convoluted it is, it can be quite a miserable experience. I say this mainly because of Fiznum's stream on the game, where almost everyone could clearly tell that he wasn't interested in the lore at all, and I think it articulates why this game can either be an amazing experience or an absolute snooze fest, depending on who plays the game. I think if you took aspects from the base game, such as the stealth sections and the animatronic chases, and a variety of stuff to do, and combine them with the aspects from Ruin such as the haunting atmosphere and interesting lore, I think you would have quite a decent FNaF game that most people would be pleased with. It feels like these two games should have been one game from the beginning, and we know this as Ruin was supposed to give us a lot of scrapped content from the base game while still having a story of its own. The story this time involves a girl named Cassie going to the Pizzaplex to find her trapped friend Gregory. To do this, we must explore various locations that we haven't seen in the base game. We're also given an AR mask that allows us to see through and pass through certain objects to access more areas. We go through areas such as the daycare, Jiku's bakery, Gator Golf, the Glamrock hair salon, etc., where we have to shut off security nodes to clear out the mesh network that is obstructing the pathways of the Pizzaplex. However, since the atrium is not accessible to the player, we have to travel to these locations via underground pathways, ladders, etc. Cassie also fixes Sun and Moon by rebooting them, which turns them into Eclipse, thus providing further development to a character that felt like they had a rush story in the base game. We also have an emotional scene between Cassie and Roxanne, and it's quite refreshing to see her development and redemption, from a narcissist to one who cares about others and protects them from harm. She's still after Gregory of course, but she cares about Cassie. Speaking of Gregory however, bit by bit, the player starts to second guess if he is truly stuck below the raceway. There are certain moments sprinkled throughout the game that give us hints about how it may not be the real Gregory. Especially considering the fact that in almost every ending of the base game, Gregory escapes. However, once you go below the Pizzaplex and finally open up the concrete wall behind which the supposed Gregory was residing, we realize that our suspicions were 100% correct. Especially when taking into account the Candy Cadet story that we can listen to not too long before the reveal, which I think was a little too on the nose as it gave out a huge hint as to the trapped Gregory's true identity. Overall, I'd say the story of Ruin is solid, but I think the execution could have been a little better. Some people argue that the story of the base game was better, and while I don't fully agree, I can understand to an extent, as it might not have been what some expected and it might not have had enough character development. For me though, I think it works decently fine. This game features 3 endings, and frankly speaking, 2 of them are quite anticlimactic. And one is decent but not that satisfactory either. The main or neutral ending being where Cassie gets chased by the mimic before escaping to the elevator, only to then end up trapped or dead, as Gregory states that they cannot risk being followed, and thus dropping the elevator and ending the game. Ending 2 is when, in that chase sequence, you go a slightly different route and see a Fredbear cutout, which you get close up to before putting on the mask. This is seen as her fantasizing a reality to make her feel as if she escaped her gruesome fate. Both these endings are quite anticlimactic in my opinion. Let's be honest, most of us knew that the real Gregory wasn't down there, or at least had a hunch about it. So, we kind of expected more after the reveal. However, it felt extremely abrupt and out of nowhere. The third ending is a bit better, where this time the mimic chases you around with a costume, but now you can enter another room and use a scooper to defeat him. Sure, it's a little more satisfactory, but just like the other two, feels quite abrupt in nature. And that's really my main issue with these endings. They really just make you go, that's it? Because we didn't get a satisfying conclusion in any way. All it is just a setup for future entries. Security Breach's endings weren't much better, but at least some of them felt more conclusive compared to this, such as the Princess Quest ending, the Freddy and Gregory escaping via van ending, etc. Although older FNaF games also didn't technically have conclusive endings, except for Pizzeria Simulator of course, it still felt a lot more achieved, not only because of the game's difficulty and the effort you put to beat it, but also because your actions led to quite surprising events, such as the Bite of 83 cutscene from FNaF 4, Michael getting scooped at the end of Sister Location, and even the Pizza Party ending from Help Wanted. All of these had substantial effects and felt as if it was a true ending to the game, while in Ruin, that isn't the case, unfortunately. Before I mention the final verdict, I would like you all to know about the opinions of some other people from the community. I actually did a survey for it, and while it didn't get many responses, which is why I won't waste your time showing the actual graphs or anything, from the ones I got, I could tell the people were content with it. I also asked YouTuber ID's Fantasy and a couple of other people from Discord about their thoughts on the game, and they're as follows. I think it's important to look back on our expectations and see if they were warranted and where the game meets said expectations and where it doesn't. My expectations for this, after playing the base game, were quite low to be honest. Security Breach, though quite the mess in terms of game design, still left me quite happy, as I was able to enjoy the game. But I was quite terrified how this DLC would come out, especially considering the insane amount of backlash that the base game got. My fears weren't put to rest after the Hello Neighbor 2 DLC, as that came out quite buggy as well. So, with all that said, let me just put this out there when I say, if you're someone who is interested in the FNaF story, or someone who likes scary and haunting atmospheres, I would recommend this game to you. However, if you're someone who focuses more on the gameplay aspects, then I would recommend you to stay away from this. And if you still want to know what happens, just watch Markiplier play it, as most people do. I know you can still try it out because it's free, which is only if you have the base game of course, but I would say, would you really want to waste 4 to 5 hours worth of your time if you know you're not going to have fun or get some enjoyment out of it? I think this is why the community is so split on Ruin, even more so than Security Breach. While one side says that it's one of the best entries in FNaF, the other says it's merely a walking simulator that allows you to see dark environments and get even more confused about the lore. In my opinion, I think Ruin was a big step towards the right direction. However, there are too many flaws that are simply too big to ignore. While Ruin is a good entry to the series, if I was talking in terms of pure enjoyment value, I would still say that I had a better time with the base game compared to the DLC. Although to be fair, I didn't really encounter that many bugs in my playthrough, which I streamed by the way, so I suppose it would also depend on that. I'm still cautiously optimistic about Help Wanted 2, but after Ruin, I have a bit more faith in Steel Wool that they can pull it off. Of course, my FNaF character analysis series isn't stopping, even if it takes a while to make those. And as I have mentioned on my community post earlier, I might even start making some theories in the future. So I hope you will all be there to enjoy those.